She froze mid-reach, hands buried in trash, then looked up at him and whispered, "Please, don't hurt me." On Christmas Eve, in a dark alley, a man feared by an entire city realized the little girl digging for food was terrified of him, and what he chose to do next would destroy his empire and save her life. But the real question is, why didn't he just walk away? If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. Thomas Pauls had built an empire on fear and absolute control. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing rattled him. Until Christmas Eve, when a little girl searching through trash in a snowy alley looked up, saw him standing there, and whispered the words that would haunt him forever. "I didn't steal anything. Please don't hurt me." What happened next shocked everyone who knew him. Thomas Pauls thought Christmas Eve would unfold like any other night, precise, controlled, solitary. Another evening of walking the perimeter behind his building, checking shadows, maintaining the discipline that had kept him alive and feared for 2 decades. But when he noticed movement near the trash bins in the narrow brick alley, he made a decision that would unravel everything he'd carefully constructed. What began as a momentary disturbance became an act of compassion so dangerous it would force him to choose between the empire he'd built and the redemption he never thought he deserved. The feared kingpin was about to discover that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with a gun, it's the one who reminds you that you're still human. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're tuning in from. We love hearing how far these stories of unexpected transformation travel. The December snow fell in silent curtains, blanketing the city in deceptive peace. Thomas Pauls buttoned his long black coat against the bitter cold as he stepped into the alley behind his building, his breath visible in the glow of the single street lamp overhead. Christmas Eve, 11:52 p.m. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, earned through years of controlling what happened in the shadows. His leather gloves creaked as he adjusted his collar, his mind already cataloging the night's remaining tasks. This walk was routine, a final check before the city surrendered completely to the holiday. No threats, no complications. Just the methodical rhythm that had defined his life for longer than he cared to remember. The alley stretched before him, narrow and cobblestoned, flanked by old brick buildings whose windows glowed with warm Christmas lights. Families inside, laughter, the distant sound of carols playing somewhere. Thomas registered these details the way a soldier registers terrain present but irrelevant. His world existed in the spaces between theirs, in the cold mathematics of power and consequence. But then something moved near the trash bins 30 feet ahead. Thomas stopped, his polished shoes silent on the snow-dusted cobblestones. His trained eyes narrowed through the falling flakes. His hand instinctively moved toward his waist, then relaxed. Too small, too hesitant, probably a cat or a rat emboldened by the holiday quiet. Except it wasn't. As Thomas took 3 measured steps forward, the figure emerged from behind an overflowing bin, and his breath caught in a way that no threat, no ambush, no betrayal had ever managed. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, wearing a torn gray sweater far too thin for the freezing night. Her dark hair fell in tangled strands across her pale face as she knelt in the dirty snow, her small hands raw and red from the cold, methodically searching through discarded food containers and crumpled bags with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Thomas stood motionless, his shadow stretching across the wet cobblestones. The girl hadn't noticed him yet. Her focus was absolute, desperate, survival sharpened into routine. She pulled an empty pizza box from the bin, checked inside, found nothing, and moved to the next bag with mechanical precision. The snow continued to fall, landing in her hair, on her thin shoulders. She didn't brush it away, didn't shiver, just kept searching. Thomas felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He had seen poverty before, had walked past homeless encampments without a second glance, had made decisions that left families destitute. This shouldn't affect him. This shouldn't matter. But it did. Maybe it was the date, Christmas Eve. Maybe it was the way her small hands trembled, not from fear but from cold and hunger. Maybe it was the terrible efficiency of her movements, a child who had learned survival the way other children learned to read. He took another step forward, his coat brushing against a stack of garbage bags. The sound was barely audible, a whisper of fabric against plastic. But the girl's head snapped up instantly, her dark eyes going wide with terror. And then she froze. Not the freeze of surprise, but the freeze of prey that knows it's been cornered. Her entire body went rigid, her breath coming in short, visible gasps. The empty container fell from her hands, clattering against the metal bin. Thomas raised his hand slowly, instinctively, the way you might approach a wounded animal. "I'm not. Please," she whispered, her voice so small it barely carried through the falling snow. "I didn't steal anything. I promise. Please don't hurt me." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. She wasn't afraid of being caught stealing. She was afraid of him, of what he might do to her. This child, alone in a freezing alley on Christmas Eve, searching trash for food, and her first concern when discovered was violence. Thomas felt something crack inside him. Some carefully maintained wall that had kept emotion separate from action, that had allowed him to function in a world where mercy was weakness and compassion was liability. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. The girl didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him with those wide, terrified eyes, ready to run if he took another step. Thomas knelt slowly, deliberately, reducing his imposing height. The snow soaked through his expensive pants, but he didn't notice. At eye level now, he could see the dirt smudged across her cheek, the chapped lips, the way her whole body trembled. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer, just watched him with that horrible, learned wariness. "I'm Thomas," he continued, keeping his voice level, calm. "And I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." Still nothing. He shifted his approach. "What are you doing out here?" The girl's eyes darted to the trash bin, then back to him. Her throat worked as she swallowed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I'm hungry." 2 words, simple, devastating. Thomas had ordered executions without hesitation, had destroyed businesses and ruined lives with a signature, had built a reputation on being unmoved by suffering. But this small voice admitting hunger in a freezing alley on Christmas Eve undid something fundamental in him. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe." The snow fell heavier now, the flakes catching in her tangled hair like small stars. Behind them, from one of the apartment windows, a Christmas song drifted into the night. Silent night, holy night. Thomas made a decision that would change everything. "Come with me," he said, standing slowly. "I'll get you something to eat." The girl didn't move. Thomas stood in the falling snow, his hand extended toward her, watching as she calculated risk versus survival. He'd seen that same calculation in the eyes of men facing impossible choices: cooperate or resist, trust or run, but never in a child, never with such practiced, heartbreaking precision. "I have food inside," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. "Hot food, and it's warm." Her eyes flickered toward the building behind him, then back to his face, searching for deception, for danger, for the catch that always came with offers too good to be true. "You won't," she started, then stopped. Her small hands twisted together, the knuckles white and cracked from the cold. "Won't what?" Thomas asked gently. "Tell anyone? Call someone?" The fear in her voice was specific, learned. She wasn't afraid of strangers in general. She was afraid of a particular kind of consequence. Thomas felt that crack inside him widen. "No, I won't call anyone. Just food, that's all." She studied him for another long moment, then gave a tiny nod. Not trust, just desperation, finally outweighing caution. As she stood, Thomas noticed how carefully she moved, slow, measured, trying not to startle him, trying to make herself smaller, less threatening, less noticeable. A child who had learned to disappear even when standing right in front of you. She followed him at a distance of exactly 6 feet. Not close enough to be grabbed, not far enough to lose sight of the only offer of help she'd received. Thomas walked slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements predictable. He didn't look back, didn't rush, just led her toward the heavy metal door at the rear of his building. The door opened with a low buzz of the security system. The girl flinched at the sound. Inside, the hallway was warm, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Thomas heard her sharp intake of breath. The sudden heat after prolonged cold could be painful. He gave her a moment to adjust before walking toward the elevator. She hesitated at the threshold, 1 foot in the warm hallway, 1 still in the snow. "3rd floor," Thomas said, pressing the call button. "My apartment." The elevator arrived with a soft ding. The girl jumped. Thomas stepped inside and held the door, waiting. After several seconds, she entered, pressing herself into the corner farthest from him. The doors closed, and the small space filled with the whir of machinery and the drip of melting snow from their clothes. In the harsh light, Thomas could see her more clearly. The gray sweater she wore was torn at the shoulder, revealing a thin undershirt beneath. Her jeans were too big, held up by a frayed belt, and her sneakers, cheap canvas, soaked through, had holes near the toes. But it was her hands that drew his attention. They were a child's hands, small and delicate, but the skin was rough and reddened, the fingernails cracked and dirty. She caught him looking and tucked her hands behind her back, shame flashing across her face. The elevator stopped. 3rd floor. Thomas's apartment was at the end of the corridor, a corner unit with reinforced doors and a security system that cost more than most people's cars. He unlocked it and stepped inside, then stopped, suddenly seeing his space through her eyes. It was sterile, precise, every surface clean, every item in its place. Black leather furniture, dark wood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city. No Christmas decorations. No photographs. No warmth. Just the ordered efficiency of a man who had never expected company, who had never wanted it. The girl stood in the doorway, not entering. "Come in," Thomas said. "Please." She took 3 small steps inside, her eyes scanning everything, the windows, the doors, the exits, always the exits. Thomas removed his coat and hung it carefully. "Sit anywhere you'd like. I'll make you something to eat." But she didn't sit, just stood near the door, ready to bolt. He moved to the kitchen, which was separated from the living room by a marble counter. He could see her while he worked intentional positioning. She needed to see that his hands were occupied, that he wasn't approaching, that she had space. Thomas opened the refrigerator. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had basics: bread, eggs, cheese. He pulled out ingredients for a sandwich, then reconsidered. She was cold. She needed something warm. He put a pan on the stove and cracked eggs into it, the sizzle filling the quiet apartment. Then he added bread to the toaster, poured a glass of orange juice, and began to make hot chocolate, real chocolate, milk, a touch of vanilla. His hands moved with the same precision he brought to everything, but his mind was elsewhere. When had she last eaten? Yesterday, maybe. How long had she been searching trash? How long had she been alone? "You can sit down," he said without turning around. "You're safe here." After a moment, he heard the soft creak of leather. She'd chosen the chair closest to the door. Of course, Thomas plated the eggs, scrambled, fluffy, with melted cheese, added the toast, buttered and still warm, poured the hot chocolate into a mug, and brought everything to the coffee table in front of her. She stared at the food like it might vanish. "Go ahead," Thomas said, stepping back to give her space. She didn't move immediately, just looked at him, then at the food, then at him again, testing, waiting for the moment when he'd snatch it away, laugh, reveal the cruelty beneath the kindness. But Thomas just walked back to the kitchen, poured himself coffee, and leaned against the counter, giving her distance, giving her control. Finally, she reached for the fork. The first bite was small, tentative. The second was larger. By the third, she was eating with desperate efficiency, barely chewing, as if the food might disappear at any moment. She held the fork in a tight grip, protective, her other hand curved around the plate. Thomas looked away. There was something too raw about watching her eat, too intimate. This hunger wasn't just physical. It was the hunger of someone who had learned that food was never guaranteed, that kindness always had conditions, that survival meant taking what you could when you could. She finished everything, every bite of egg, every crumb of toast, drained the hot chocolate. Then she set the fork down carefully, precisely, and folded her hands in her lap. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "What's your name?" She hesitated, weighing even this small piece of information. "Layla." "Layla," Thomas repeated. "That's a beautiful name." She didn't respond, but something flickered in her eyes. When was the last time someone had said something kind to her? Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, sitting in the chair across from her. Not close. Not threatening. "Layla, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Can you do that?" She nodded, but her body tensed. "Where are your parents?" And just like that, the fragile moment shattered. Her face crumpled, then hardened just as quickly. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt still embedded under her broken nails. "My mom is gone," she said finally, her voice flat, empty. The tone of someone who had said those words before, who had learned that emotion only made it hurt more. Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Gone? She died. Last year." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Thomas had heard confessions before, had listened to men explain their betrayals, their failures, their desperation. But this was different. This was a child stating a fact that should never have become her reality. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in years. Layla shrugged, a small, practiced gesture that tried to minimize something enormous. It was fast. They said she didn't hurt. They, doctors probably, social workers, adults who had tried to comfort her with clinical kindness and then disappeared back into their professional lives, leaving her alone with the weight of it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, giving her space. "And your father? I never knew him." Layla's voice remained flat, detached. She'd built walls around this pain, and Thomas recognized the architecture. He'd built similar ones himself. "What about other family? Grandparents? Aunts? Uncles?" She shook her head. "Mom said there was family somewhere, but we never saw them. I don't know their names, don't know where they live." Her fingers traced the edge of the empty plate. "Mom said it was complicated." Complicated. That word covered so many sins, so many fractures that never healed. "So who takes care of you now?" Thomas asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Layla's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the plate, refusing to meet his. "I take care of myself." "Layla, I do fine," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I know where to find food. I know how to stay warm. I know—" "You were searching through trash in the snow on Christmas Eve," Thomas said gently but firmly. "That's not fine." Her face flushed, shame and defiance mixing together. "I didn't have a choice." "Why not? Where do you live?" The question landed like a stone. Layla's composure cracked, and for the first time since entering his apartment, tears welled in her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, her small hands balling into fists. "I don't," she whispered. "Not anymore." Thomas waited, his instincts telling him not to push, to let her reveal this at her own pace. He'd learned long ago that silence could extract truth better than any interrogation. Layla took a shaky breath. "After Mom died, they said I had to live with him." "Him?" "Richard. My stepfather." She said the word, like it tasted bitter. "Mom married him 2 years ago. He seemed nice then. He smiled a lot, brought me presents." Thomas heard the past tense, the shift. "What changed?" "Everything." Layla's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When Mom got sick, he stopped smiling, stopped talking to me except to tell me to be quiet. After she died, he looked at me like I was a problem he didn't want to solve." Thomas felt a cold anger beginning to build, the kind that settled in his bones and turned calculating. "Did he hurt you?" Layla hesitated, and that hesitation told him more than words could. "Not at first. He just ignored me. Worked late. Came home and drank. I'd make dinner for myself, do my homework alone, go to bed. It was like living with a ghost. But then," Thomas prompted, "then he started getting angry." Her voice trembled now, the walls crumbling. "About everything. About dishes in the sink. About my backpack in the hall. About me existing in the same space as him. He'd yell for hours about how I was ungrateful, how much I cost him, how he didn't ask for this." Thomas's hands tightened on the armrest, but he kept his voice calm. "Did the yelling escalate?" Layla nodded, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. "He'd throw things. Not at me, but near me. Plates, books. Once he threw a chair across the kitchen because I asked if we could have dinner together." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand. "And then he started pushing me, just a little at first, out of the way when I was in the hallway, away from the refrigerator when he wanted something. But it got harder, rougher. The apartment was silent except for the quiet hum of the heating system. Thomas sat perfectly still. But inside, something dark and familiar was awakening the part of him that understood violence, that knew how to apply it with precision. "I tried to be invisible," Layla continued, her voice breaking. "I tried to stay in my room. I tried not to need anything, not to ask for anything. But it didn't matter. He'd find reasons. Said I reminded him of Mom, and that looking at me made him angry. Said I was a burden he never wanted." "How long did this go on?" Thomas asked quietly. "Months, maybe 6. I don't know." The days all blurred together. Layla's shoulders shook. "And then 3 weeks ago, he came home really drunk, started yelling about money, about bills, about how much easier his life would be if I just disappeared. He grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises, and he said—" She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. What did he say? Layla. He said he wished I'd died instead of Mom. The words landed like a gunshot. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to remain calm, to not react in a way that would scare this child who had already been scared enough for a lifetime. That's when I left, Layla said, her voice steadier now, as if speaking it aloud had released something. I waited until he passed out, took my backpack, put in some clothes, and the only picture I have of Mom. Left in the middle of the night and didn't go back. 3 weeks ago, Thomas said. You've been on the streets for 3 weeks? She nodded. I stayed in a shelter for a few days, but they asked too many questions. Said they'd have to call social services. I was scared they'd send me back to him, so I left. And you've been alone since then? Yes. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Layla, what about school? Teachers? Didn't anyone notice you were missing? A bitter smile crossed her young face. Too old for someone her age. Richard called me in sick, said I had the flu, and winter break started 2 weeks ago, so nobody's checking. By the time school starts again, I'll just be another kid who moved away. The casual way she said it, the acceptance that she could simply disappear without anyone caring, broke something in Thomas that he thought was long beyond breaking. Did you try to find your family, your mother's relatives? I don't know where to start. Mom never talked about them. I don't have addresses, phone numbers, nothing. For all I know, they don't even know I exist. Alone. Completely, utterly alone. A child navigating a hostile world with nothing but survival instinct and fear. Thomas stood slowly, walked to the window. The snow was still falling, covering the city in white. Somewhere out there, a man was sleeping off his drunken rage, probably not even noticing the child who'd fled his cruelty. You're not going back there, Thomas said, his voice harder than he intended. Lila looked up at him, confusion and hope warring on her face. What? You're not going back to him, ever. Layla stared at Thomas as if she'd misheard him. What do you mean? Thomas turned from the window, his expression set with the same finality he brought to every irreversible decision he'd ever made. I mean, you're staying here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. But you're not going back to that man. Not tonight. Not ever. But you don't even know me, Layla said, confusion evident in her voice. Why would you? Because no child should be searching through trash for food on Christmas Eve, Thomas interrupted. Because no child should be afraid to go home. Because it's the right thing to do. The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd done something simply because it was right? When was the last time he'd made a decision that didn't calculate profit, leverage, or strategic advantage? Layla's lower lip trembled. You're not going to call the police? Or social services? Thomas considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated. The legal thing would be to contact authorities, to let the system handle this. But he'd seen enough of how systems worked, how children got lost in bureaucracy, how they ended up in worse situations than the ones they'd escaped. And something deeper, something he didn't want to examine too closely, told him that this child had found her way to him for a reason. Not tonight, he said. Tonight you're safe. That's all that matters right now. Layla nodded slowly, but her body remained tense, coiled, ready to run if this kindness revealed itself as another form of cruelty. Thomas glanced at the clock. 12:47 a.m. Christmas Day now. You need sleep. Real sleep, in a real bed. Come on. He led her down the hallway, acutely aware of how she maintained that same careful distance close enough to follow, far enough to escape. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, his own, stark and utilitarian, and a guest room that had never housed a guest. Thomas opened the door to the spare room. It was as impersonal as the rest of the apartment, a queen bed with white linens, a dresser, a lamp. No decoration, no warmth, but clean and safe. The bathroom is there, he said, pointing to the adjacent door. There are clean towels in the cabinet. Do you want to take a shower? Get warm? Layla looked at the bathroom like it was a luxury she'd forgotten existed. Yes, please. Take your time. I'll find you something clean to wear. He left her standing in the doorway, still hesitant, still waiting for the catch. In his own room, Thomas searched through his dresser. Everything he owned was too large for a child, but he found an old t-shirt that would work as a nightgown and a pair of sweatpants with a drawstring. He knocked softly on the guest room door. It opened a crack she hadn't gone into the bathroom yet. Here, he said, handing her the clothes through the gap. They'll be big, but they're clean and warm. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas returned to the living room and stood at the window, watching the snow fall over the city. Below, The streets were empty, the occasional car passing through pools of streetlight. Somewhere in this city, Richard was probably asleep, unaware that the burden he'd wished away had found protection in the most unlikely place. Thomas pulled out his phone, scrolled through contacts, stopped on a name. He typed a message. Need information on someone. Richard. Last name unknown. Stepfather to a child named Layla. Approximately 8 years old. Mother deceased within the last year. Address probably within 5 miles of downtown. Send me everything. The response came within seconds. On it. We'll have it by morning. Thomas put the phone away. Information first, then decisions. The sound of running water came from down the hall. He tried to imagine what Layla was feeling. The first hot shower in 3 weeks, soap, shampoo, safety. The simple dignities that everyone deserved but not everyone received. 20 minutes passed before he heard the bathroom door open. He stayed in the living room, giving her privacy, giving her space to exist without surveillance. When she finally appeared in the doorway, she looked different. Cleaner. Yes, but also younger somehow. The dirt and survival had aged her. But now, in a too large t-shirt that hung to her knees, her dark hair damp and combed back, she looked like what she was, a child who should be worried about homework and friends, not where her next meal would come from. Feel better? Thomas asked. She nodded. I forgot what hot water felt like. The casual statement hit Thomas harder than any accusation could have. She'd forgotten. In 3 weeks, she'd forgotten the basic comfort of hot water. You should sleep, he said. The bed is comfortable. There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Layla didn't move. What do you do? For work, I mean. The question was inevitable, but Thomas still wasn't prepared for it. How did you explain to a child that you made your living in shadows, that your power came from fear, that the apartment she was standing in was paid for by things she should never know about? I handle problems for people, he said carefully. Business problems. Are you going to handle Richard? The directness of the question surprised him. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was asking because she needed to know if the monster who'd terrified her would face consequences. Yes, Thomas said simply. He won't hurt you again, I promise you that. Something in Layla's expression shifted, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of belief that someone was finally on her side. Why are you helping me? She asked. You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. Thomas studied her. Are you? No. Then that's why. He paused, choosing his words carefully. A long time ago, I had a daughter. She would have been about your age now. What happened to her? I lost her. Made choices that took me away from her. And by the time I realized what I'd given up, it was too late to get it back. Thomas met Layla's eyes. I can't fix that. Can't undo those choices. But maybe I can make sure you're safe. Maybe that counts for something. Layla was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'm sorry you lost her. The simple empathy from a child who had every reason to be hardened, bitter, closed off, it nearly undid him. Get some sleep, Layla, Thomas said, his voice rougher than intended. Tomorrow, things will look different. She turned toward the guest room, then stopped. Mr. Thomas? Just Thomas is fine. Thomas, she corrected. Will you still be here in the morning? You won't leave while I'm sleeping? I'll be here, he promised. Right down the hall. If you need anything, my door is open. She nodded and disappeared into the guest room. The door didn't close, completely left open, just enough that she could hear, could escape, could verify he was still there. Thomas waited until he heard the bed creak, then moved silently down the hall. Through the crack in the door, he could see her curled under the blankets, her small form barely making a dent in the large bed. He returned to the living room and sat in the darkness, watching the snow fall and wondering what the hell he'd just committed himself to. Protecting a child meant exposure, vulnerability, weakness that enemies would exploit. It meant complications he'd spent decades avoiding. It meant opening doors he'd sealed shut for good reasons. But as he sat there in the silence of Christmas morning, Thomas realized something. Those doors had never been locked. They'd just been waiting for someone worth opening them for. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness of his living room, watching the city lights blur through the falling snow, his mind working through scenarios and contingencies the way it always did. Except this time, the variables were different. This time, he wasn't planning an operation or calculating leverage. He was planning how to protect a child who'd stumbled into his life 12 hours ago. At 6:47 a.m., his phone buzzed with an incoming message. Richard Brennan. 1247 Ashford Street, Apartment 3B. Works maintenance at Riverside Hospital. Swing shift. Criminal record. 2 DUIs, 1 domestic disturbance call from previous relationship, charges dropped. Financial records show gambling debts, late rent payments. Neighbors report hearing arguments. Building manager says the kid hasn't been seen in weeks. He told school she moved to live with relatives in Ohio. Thomas read the message twice, committing every detail to memory, then deleted it. Richard Brennan. Now the monster had a name, an address, a pattern. That made him manageable. Another message followed. What do you need? Thomas typed back. Nothing yet. Just information. Boss. If you need cleanup. I said just information. The response was immediate. Understood. Thomas set the phone down and stood, moving to the window. The snow had stopped, leaving the city blanketed in white that would turn gray by afternoon. Christmas morning. Families would be waking up, children running to see what gifts waited under trees. Normal lives, normal joys. Behind him, he heard a soft creak. He turned to find Layla standing in the hallway, still wearing his too large t-shirt, her damp hair now dry and falling around her shoulders. She looked rested but wary, as if sleep had restored some energy but not trust. Good morning, Thomas said. You're still here, she said, and the relief in her voice was unmistakable. I told you I would be. She nodded, then glanced around the apartment as if seeing it clearly for the first time in daylight. What happens now? Thomas had been asking himself the same question for hours. The smart thing would be to contact proper authorities, ensure she was placed in appropriate care, distance himself from a situation that could only complicate his carefully controlled life. But when he looked at Layla, at the guardedness in her eyes, the tension in her small shoulders, he knew what he was going to do. First, breakfast, he said. Then we talk about your stepfather. Layla's body went rigid at the mention of Richard. What about him? I'm going to make sure he never hurts you again. How? Thomas moved to the kitchen, pulling out eggs and bread. Let me worry about that. Your job is to stay here. Stay safe. Can you do that? She followed him but kept the counter between them, maintaining that careful distance. You're going to see him? Yes. When? Today. Layla's hands gripped the edge of the counter. What are you going to do to him? Thomas cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the silence while he considered his answer. He wouldn't lie to her, she'd had enough lies from adults. But he couldn't tell her the full truth either. I'm going to have a conversation with him, Thomas said carefully. And I'm going to make absolutely certain he understands that you are under my protection now. That if he ever tries to find you, if he ever tries to hurt you again, there will be consequences he doesn't want to face. He won't listen, Layla said quietly. He doesn't listen to anyone. Thomas looked at her, and for just a moment, let her see something of who he really was. The cold certainty, the absolute authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. He'll listen to me, Thomas said. Something in his tone made Layla's eyes widen slightly. She didn't know what he was, didn't understand the world he moved through. But some instinct told her that when Thomas Powell spoke, people listened. They ate breakfast in silence, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. Layla ate slower this time, not with the desperate hunger of last night, but still with the carefulness of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. After, Thomas made a phone call. Layla couldn't hear what he said, but when he returned, he had his coat on. I need you to stay here, he told her. Don't answer the door for anyone. Don't go outside. There's food in the kitchen. The TV works. You'll be safe. I'll be back in a few hours. You promise? The question was small, vulnerable. I promise. Thomas left her standing in the living room, looking smaller than ever in the large space. As he rode the elevator down, he felt something unfamiliar, a pull to return, to not leave her alone. He pushed it aside. What he had to do, she couldn't see. The drive to Ashford Street took 20 minutes. Thomas parked 2 blocks away and walked, his long black coat buttoning against the Christmas morning cold. The neighborhood was tired old brick buildings, rusted fire escapes, the kind of place where people minded their business because they had their own problems to worry about. 1,247. Ashford was a 3-story walk-up with peeling paint and a broken mailbox. Thomas didn't hesitate. He entered through the unlocked main door, building security was a joke, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Apartment 3B, Christmas wreath on the door, ironic and obscene given what happened behind it. Thomas knocked, calm, measured, 3 times. Movement inside. Footsteps. The door opened a crack, chain still attached. Richard Brennan looked exactly like Thomas expected, late 30s, unshaven, bloodshot eyes, wearing a stained t-shirt and sweatpants. The smell of stale alcohol wafted through the gap. "What?" Richard's voice was rough, annoyed at being disturbed. Thomas didn't answer immediately, just looked at him, let the silence stretch, let the man's irritation turn to unease. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded. "We need to talk about Layla," Thomas said quietly. Richard's expression shifted confusion, then recognition, then something like relief. "She came back? Where is she? Little brat's been gone for—" "She's not coming back," Thomas interrupted. "And you're going to understand why." Richard's face darkened. "Listen, I don't know who you are, but that kid is my responsibility. Her mother married me, and that makes her—" "Nothing," Thomas said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "She is nothing to you anymore. You lost any claim to her the moment you put your hands on her." Richard's jaw clenched. "She's been telling stories, has she? Ungrateful little—" Thomas moved before Richard could finish the sentence. He pushed the door hard enough that the chain snapped, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him with deliberate calm. The apartment was a disaster, empty bottles, unwashed dishes, the stench of neglect and anger. Richard stumbled backward. "Hey, you can't just—" "Sit down," Thomas said. Something in his voice, the absolute authority, the implicit threat, made Richard obey. He sank onto a stained couch, suddenly aware that he'd misjudged this situation badly. Thomas stood over him, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. But his eyes held something that made Richard's bravado crumble. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "You're going to forget Layla exists. You're not going to look for her. You're not going to report her missing. You're not going to tell anyone about her. As far as you're concerned, she moved away to live with relatives, exactly like you told her school." "You can't tell me." "I can," Thomas interrupted. "And I am, because if I hear that you've tried to find her, if I hear that you've asked questions, if I hear that you've so much as spoken her name—" He paused, leaning forward slightly. "I will come back, and next time, we won't have a conversation." Richard's face had gone pale. "Who are you?" Thomas straightened. "Someone you don't want to know. Someone who keeps promises. And I promised that child she would never be afraid of you again." He let the silence settle, let Richard's imagination fill in the blanks. Men like Richard understood violence, they dealt it to those weaker than themselves. But they also recognized when they were facing something beyond their weight class. "Do we understand each other?" Thomas asked. Richard nodded, his earlier anger replaced by genuine fear. "Say it," Thomas commanded. We understand each other." "Good." Thomas walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. The bruises on her arm, the fear in her eyes, the fact that she was searching trash for food on Christmas Eve. I remember all of it. And men who hurt children don't get second chances in my world. This is your only warning." He left without waiting for a response, descended the stairs, and walked back to his car with the same measured calm he'd arrived with. It was done. No witnesses, no violence necessary, just absolute certainty delivered with quiet precision. Richard Brennan would never bother Layla again. Thomas had seen the fear in the man's eyes, the recognition that he'd been given a choice between life and consequences, and he'd chosen survival. As Thomas drove back toward his apartment, he felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not pride, but simply the knowledge that he'd drawn a line and no one would cross it. When he opened his apartment door an hour later, Layla was exactly where he'd left her, curled on the couch with a blanket. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Is he—" she started. "He won't hurt you again," Thomas said, removing his coat. "You have my word." "How do you know?" "Because he understands what happens if he does." Layla studied him for a long moment. "You scared him." "Yes." "Good," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "What happens to me now?" Thomas sat in the chair across from her. This was the question he'd been avoiding, the one without easy answers. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. Layla looked surprised, as if no one had asked her opinion in longer than she could remember. "I don't want to go back to him. I don't want to go to a shelter. I don't want strangers deciding where I belong." "Then you stay here," Thomas said. "For now. Until we figure out something permanent. Here, with you? If that's what you want." Layla's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Why would you do that?" "Because everyone deserves a safe place," Thomas said simply. "And right now this is yours." 3 days passed, then a week, then 2. Layla moved through Thomas's apartment like a ghost at first. Quiet, careful, expecting at any moment to be told she'd overstayed her welcome. She ate small portions, asked for nothing, and apologized for existing in ways that made Thomas's chest tighten. But slowly, gradually, something began to shift. On the third day, she laughed at something on television, a surprised, genuine sound that she immediately tried to suppress. On the fifth day, she asked if she could take a book from his shelf. On the eighth day, she fell asleep on the couch instead of retreating to the guest room the moment evening arrived. Thomas watched these small transformations with something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or hope. Dangerous emotions for a man who'd built his life on control and detachment. But with each passing day, he also became more aware of the impossibility of the situation. Layla couldn't simply exist in limbo. She needed structure, education, normalcy, things he had no idea how to provide. On a gray January morning, Thomas sat at his kitchen counter with coffee and made a list. Not the kind of list he usually made. Targets, debts, operations. This one was different. School enrollment, medical checkup, legal guardianship, therapist, age-appropriate activities, real clothes, not just my old t-shirts. He stared at the list like it was written in a foreign language. These were the concerns of fathers, of guardians, of people who lived in the light. Not men like him. What are you writing? Thomas looked up to find Layla standing in the hallway, wearing the sweatpants and sweater he'd bought her during an awkward shopping trip 2 days ago. Her hair was getting longer, healthier. The hollows in her cheeks were filling in. Things we need to figure out, Thomas said. She approached cautiously, as she still did, and peered at the list. School? You can't just stay here all day. You need education. Layla's expression darkened. What if they ask questions? What if they want to know where I've been? We'll handle it. Thomas set down his pen. But Layla, we need to talk about this, about what happens next. I can't keep you hidden here forever. That's not a life. It's better than the one I had, she said quietly. Better isn't good enough. Thomas turned to face her fully. You deserve more than just better. You deserve normal. Friends, school, a childhood. I don't need normal, Layla insisted, her voice rising slightly. I just need to be safe. You can have both. She shook her head, fear creeping into her eyes. If people start asking questions, if they find out about Richard, they'll put me in the system. Foster care. And then I'll just be moved around until I'm 18, and nobody will care what happens to me. Thomas recognized the fear she'd done research, probably during the 3 weeks she'd been on the streets, talked to other kids, heard the stories. That's not going to happen, Thomas said firmly. How do you know? Because I won't let it. Layla studied him with that too-old wisdom in her young eyes. You can't promise that. You're not my parent. You're not family. The state won't care what you want. She was right, and they both knew it. The legal reality was complicated, messy, potentially dangerous for both of them. Thomas had been avoiding this conversation, but it couldn't be delayed any longer. Then we make it legal, Thomas said, the decision forming as he spoke. I'll become your legal guardian. Layla's eyes widened. You can do that? I can try. It won't be simple, but I have resources. Lawyers who can navigate the system. He paused, making sure she understood. But Layla, if we do this, if I become your guardian, there are rules, boundaries that we both have to respect. What kind of rules? Thomas stood, walked to the window. How did he explain this? How did he tell a child that the man protecting her was also someone she needed protection from? My work, he began carefully. The things I do, the people I deal with. You can never be part of that world. Never. What do you mean? Thomas turned to face her. I mean that my business stays completely separate from you. You'll never meet my associates. You'll never be in the room when I'm handling work. You'll never hear conversations you shouldn't hear. There will be parts of my life that are locked away from you, and they have to stay that way. Layla frowned. Why? Because my world is dangerous, Thomas said bluntly. And if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to raise you, then I need to know you're protected from that danger, which means keeping you completely away from it. Are you a criminal? The question was direct, fearless. Thomas considered lying, considered deflecting. But he'd promised himself he wouldn't treat her like a child too young to handle truth. I operate in gray areas, he said carefully. I solve problems for people who can't use legal channels. Sometimes that means bending rules. Sometimes it means breaking them. But I'm going to be honest with you, I will never involve you in any of it. You'll go to school, you'll have friends, you'll live a normal life, and what I do to make that possible stays in the shadows where it belongs. Layla was quiet for a long moment. Will you teach me to defend myself? The question surprised him. Why? Because I don't want to be afraid anymore. I don't want to be the kid who gets hurt, who runs away, who can't fight back. Her small hands clenched into fists. You said your world is dangerous. But the normal world is dangerous too. Richard was normal. He went to work, paid bills, looked like everyone else, and he still hurt me. Thomas saw the logic, the pain behind it. She was right, danger didn't just live in his world of shadows and secrets. Self-defense, he said finally. Discipline, confidence. I can teach you those things, but not violence. There's a difference. What difference? Violence is about hurting people. Self-defense is about protecting yourself. One creates victims, the other prevents them. Thomas crossed his arms. If I teach you, you follow my rules. You learn control before you learn techniques. You learn when not to fight before you learn how to fight. Understood? Layla nodded seriously. Understood. And school, Thomas continued. Non-negotiable. You'll attend. You'll do the work. You'll get an education that gives you choices I never had. Okay. And therapy. You've been through trauma. You need someone to talk to. Someone trained to help kids process what you've experienced. Layla's face showed resistance. I can talk to you. You can, Thomas agreed. But I'm not a therapist, and there are things you might need to work through that I'm not equipped to help with. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Thomas sat back down, meeting her eyes. Here's what I'm offering. A home. Safety. Structure. Education. A chance at a normal life. But it comes with boundaries. My work never touches you. You never ask about it. Never get involved in it. Never even think about it. Can you accept that? What happens when I'm older? Layla asked. When I'm a teenager, and I start asking harder questions? We'll deal with that when it comes. But the rule stays the same, my world and yours don't intersect. Layla chewed her lip, thinking, what if your work puts you in danger? What if something happens to you? The question hit Thomas unexpectedly. She was worried about him. This child who'd been abandoned and abused was concerned about what would happen to the stranger who'd taken her in. I'm careful, Thomas said. I've survived this long because I'm smart about risk. But if something ever did happen, there are people who would make sure you're taken care of. You'd never be alone again. Promise? I promise. Layla took a deep breath. Then yes, I accept your rules. I'll stay away from your work. I'll go to school. I'll do therapy if you think I need it. I'll learn to defend myself your way. She paused. But I have a rule too. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What rule? You don't lie to me. If I ask you a direct question about who you are or what you do, you give me a real answer. You can tell me it's not something I should know about. You can say it's off limits, but you don't lie. Deal? Smart. She was negotiating boundaries, establishing her own terms. Thomas felt a flicker of something like pride. Deal, he said, extending his hand. Layla shook it, her small hand disappearing in his larger one. The gesture felt formal, binding a contract between two people trying to build something neither of them fully understood. So what happens now? Layla asked. Thomas glanced at his list. Now I make some calls. Start the process of making this official. It won't be fast, and it won't be easy, but we'll figure it out. Together? Together. That afternoon, while Layla read on the couch, Thomas made the first call, to a lawyer he'd used before, discreet, expensive, skilled at navigating complicated situations. I need to become legal guardian of a child, Thomas said without preamble. There was a pause. You have a child? It's complicated. It always is with you. The lawyer sighed. Walk me through it. Thomas explained carefully, strategically, omitting details that didn't need to be shared. The lawyer listened, asked questions, and finally said, This is going to take time. Background checks, home studies, possibly court appearances. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Thomas looked at Layla, curled up with a book, finally starting to look like a child instead of a survivor. Yes, he said. I'm prepared, because for the first time in 20 years, Thomas Powell's had something worth being scrutinized for. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks later. Thomas was in his study, the one room in the apartment Layla had been told was off limits, when his phone buzzed with a message from one of his lieutenants. People are asking questions. About the girl. Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd known this moment would come. In his world, nothing stayed hidden for long. Someone had seen Layla coming or going from the building. Someone had noticed Thomas buying children's clothes, enrolling a child in school, acting like a man with something to protect. And in his line of work, anything you protected became a liability. He typed back. What kind of questions? Curious ones. For now. But curiosity turns into opportunity. You know how this works. Thomas did know. He'd exploited the same pattern himself. Find what matters to someone, and you find their pressure point. Their weakness. Their breaking point. Who's asking? Dmitri's people. Casually. Like they're just making conversation. Dmitri Volkov. A rival with ambitions and a reputation for finding creative ways to eliminate competition. Thomas had been expecting Dmitri to make a move eventually, but he'd hoped to have more time to establish Layla's guardianship, to make her legally untouchable. Tell them nothing, Thomas typed, and let me know if the questions stop being casual. He set the phone down and stared at the wall. This was the complication he'd feared from the beginning. By taking Layla in, by caring about her safety, he'd given his enemies exactly what they'd been looking for: leverage. A soft knock on the study door pulled him from his thoughts. Thomas? Layla's voice, tentative. Is everything okay? He'd told her never to disturb him when the study door was closed. The fact that she was asking meant she'd sensed something was wrong. Thomas opened the door. Layla stood in the hallway, wearing the jeans and sweater that actually fit her now, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked healthier, stronger, almost normal. Everything's fine, Thomas said, forcing his voice to remain calm. But Layla had learned to read people during her time on the streets. You're lying. Thomas remembered their deal. No lies. There's a situation, he admitted, related to my work. Nothing for you to worry about. Is it about me? She wasn't backing down. Thomas hesitated, then nodded slightly. People have noticed you're here. They're asking questions. Fear flickered across Layla's face. What kind of people? The kind who look for advantages. The kind who use information as currency. Thomas kept his tone even, controlled. But I'm handling it. Maybe I should leave, Layla said quietly. Go somewhere else, so they can't use me against you. The suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. She was willing to sacrifice her own safety for his. This child who'd finally found shelter was prepared to walk back into danger to protect him. No, Thomas said firmly. That's not happening. You're staying here, and you're staying safe. This is my problem to solve. But if I'm making things dangerous for you, Layla. Thomas placed his hands on her shoulders, meeting her eyes. Listen to me. You are not a problem. You are not a burden. And you are not responsible for the choices I've made. I knew what I was doing when I took you in, and I knew there would be complications. That's on me, not you. But. No buts. You're staying. End of discussion. He released her shoulders, his tone softening. Go finish your homework. I have some calls to make. Layla lingered, clearly wanting to argue further, but something in Thomas's expression stopped her. She nodded slowly and retreated to her room. Thomas returned to his study and made the first call. We need to talk, he said when the line connected. Tonight, usual place. The meeting took place in a warehouse Thomas owned on the industrial edge of the city. 5 men sat around a scarred wooden table, his most trusted associates, the ones who'd helped him build and maintain his empire. They looked at him with a mixture of respect and confusion. Thomas rarely called emergency meetings, and he never showed concern. But tonight, they could see the tension in his posture, the calculation in his eyes. Dmitri's people are asking about the girl, Thomas began without preamble. Which means Dmitri knows I've got someone in my life now. Someone who matters. One of the men, a scarred veteran named Jacob, spoke up. We can handle Dmitri. Send a message. Make it clear that she's off limits. That just confirms she's important, another man said. Shows we're worried. Makes her more valuable as a target. Thomas had already considered both approaches. Neither option works. If we do nothing, Dmitri tests boundaries until he finds one we'll defend. If we react too strongly, we confirm what he suspects. So what's the play? Jacob asked. Thomas stood, walked to the window overlooking the dark warehouse floor. I'm pulling back. Silence fell over the room. Someone finally spoke. Pulling back from what? Everything. Operations, territory, the business. The reaction was immediate and loud. You can't be serious. We've spent years building this. All of it? Because of one kid? Thomas turned to face them. Yes, all of it. Because that kid deserves a chance at a normal life, and she can't have that while I'm in this world. Every day I stay in this business, I put her at risk. So I'm getting out. Jacob shook his head. Thomas, you walk away from this. There's going to be a war. Everyone we've kept in check will see it as an opening. People will die. Then make sure our people are protected in the transition, Thomas said. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm restructuring, delegating, creating enough distance that when someone looks at me, they see a civilian, not a target. That's not how this works. One of the younger men protested. You don't just quit. People will think you're weak. They'll come after you anyway, just to prove they can. Let them try, Thomas said coldly. I'm leaving the business, not forgetting how to operate. Anyone who mistakes restraint for weakness will learn the difference. Jacob studied him for a long moment. This is really about the girl? You're giving up everything for a kid you've known for a month? Thomas didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because she's been let down by every adult in her life. Because she deserves someone who keeps their promises. Because I've spent 20 years building an empire. And what did it get me? An empty apartment and enemies. She's 8 years old, and she's braver than most men I've known. If protecting her means walking away from this, then that's what I do. The room was silent. These men had followed Thomas because he was ruthless, strategic, uncompromising. But they'd never seen him like this, making a decision based on something other than profit or power. Finally, Jacob nodded. Okay, we'll help with the transition. But Thomas, you need to understand walking away makes you vulnerable during the process. Until people accept you're really out, you're in more danger than ever. I know. And the girl? If something happens to you during this transition? Thomas had already prepared for that. I've set up a trust. Legal guardianship transfers to my lawyer if anything happens to me. She'll be taken care of. Financially secure. Away from all of this. You've thought this through. I've thought of nothing else for 3 weeks. Another man spoke up. What do you need from us? Time. Cover. Make the transition look natural. Like I'm delegating because business is good, not because I'm leaving. Redirect questions about Layla. And most importantly, make it clear to everyone, Dimitri especially, that she's not a route to me, that touching her brings consequences even after I'm out. That sends a mixed message, Jacob pointed out. You're leaving to protect her, but you're still threatening people over her? I'm leaving the business, Thomas corrected. I'm not becoming a different person. Anyone who hurts her will still answer to me. That message needs to be crystal clear. The men exchanged glances, then nodded one by one. How long until you're out completely? Jacob asked. 6 months, maybe less. I need to liquidate assets, transfer operations, tie up loose ends. But every day, I'm less involved, less visible, less vulnerable. And if Dimitri makes a move before then? Thomas's expression hardened. Then I remind everyone why they feared me in the first place. I'm walking away, but I'm not walking away weak. The meeting lasted another hour as they discussed specifics, which operations to dissolve, which to transfer, how to handle the inevitable questions and power struggles. By the time Thomas left, the plan was in motion. But as he drove back to his apartment through the dark city streets, Thomas felt the weight of what he'd committed to. He was dismantling everything he'd built, walking away from the only life he'd known for 2 decades. All for a child who'd looked at him with terrified eyes in a snowy alley and whispered, "Please don't hurt me." When he entered the apartment, it was nearly midnight. He expected Layla to be asleep, but she was curled on the couch, a book open in her lap, her eyes heavy. "You're still up," Thomas said. "I wanted to make sure you came back," she admitted quietly. Thomas sat in the chair across from her. "I told you I would. I know. But I still wanted to make sure." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Layla spoke again. "Are we going to be okay?" Thomas looked at this child who'd already survived more than most adults, who'd learned to fear the very people who should have protected her, who'd found the courage to trust again despite every reason not to. "Yes," he said. "We're going to be okay." "How do you know?" "Because I've made a choice. And when I make a choice, I see it through, no matter what it costs." Layla studied him with those 2 wise eyes. "What's it costing you?" Thomas considered the question. His empire, his power, his identity, everything he'd spent his adult life building. "Nothing that matters more than you being safe," he said simply. And for the first time since her mother died, Layla smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Go to bed. School tomorrow." She stood, then hesitated. "Thomas? I'm glad I found you. In that alley. I'm glad it was you." Before he could respond, she disappeared down the hallway to her room. Thomas sat alone in the darkness, listening to the city outside, and realized something profound. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen something more important than survival. He'd chosen love. The attack came on a Tuesday. Thomas was walking Layla home from school, a routine he'd started 3 weeks into the transition. She'd protested at first, saying she could walk the 4 blocks alone, but he'd insisted, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't trust the world. They were 2 blocks from the apartment when Thomas noticed the car. Black sedan, tinted windows, moving too slowly for traffic. His instincts flared the awareness that had kept him alive for 20 years, screaming that something was wrong. "Layla," he said quietly, his hand moving to her shoulder. "When I say run, you run straight to the apartment building. Don't look back. Don't stop. Use your key and lock the door behind you. Understand?" Her eyes widened. "What's happening?" "Just answer. Do you understand?" "Yes." The sedan pulled to the curb 30 feet ahead. 2 men stepped out, professional, controlled, hands in their coat pockets. Thomas recognized the body language. These weren't street thugs. These were operators. "Run," Thomas said. Layla bolted. The men's attention snapped to her fleeing form, and one started to move in her direction. Thomas stepped into his path, his voice calm and lethal. "You take 1 more step toward her, and you don't walk away from this street." The man stopped, reassessing. Behind him, the second man emerged fully from the car. 3 against 1 now, because the driver was climbing out too. "Mr. Powells," the first man said, his accent thick Eastern European. "Dimitri's people. We just want to talk. Talk from there. Dimitri wants to meet. Discuss your transition. Make sure there are no misunderstandings." Thomas kept his body positioned between them and the direction Layla had run. "Tell Dimitri I'm out. Completely out. There's nothing to discuss." "But there is." The man's smile was cold. "See, when a man like you walks away, it creates opportunities. Territories shift. Agreements need renegotiating. And Dimitri wants to make sure everyone understands the new arrangement. The arrangement is simple. I'm done. The operations transfer to Jacob and the others. Anyone with questions takes them up with Jacob." "And the girl?" The man tilted his head. "She part of this arrangement too?" Every muscle in Thomas's body went rigid. "She's not part of anything. She's a child under my protection. That's where this conversation ends. Dimitri just wants assurances that your retirement won't create problems for established business relationships." Thomas understood what wasn't being said. Dimitri wanted leverage, wanted to know if Thomas could be controlled through Layla, if the legendary Thomas Powells could be manipulated by threatening a child. "Here's your assurance," Thomas said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and absolute. "I'm leaving the business. But if anyone, Dimitri, or anyone else makes the mistake of thinking that makes me weak, if anyone touches that girl or even looks at her wrong, I will come out of retirement for exactly as long as it takes to eliminate the threat. Permanently. Completely. Without mercy." That's the only assurance Dimitri gets. The men exchanged glances. The first one shrugged. "Dimitri thought you might say something like that, which is why he asked us to deliver a message." "What message?" "That weakness is a language men in our business understand. And you, Mr. Powells, have shown yours." The man's hand moved inside his coat. Thomas reacted instantly, crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, caught the man's wrist before the weapon cleared, and twisted hard. The gun clattered to the pavement, a knee to the ribs, an elbow to the jaw. The man dropped. The second man lunged. Thomas sidestepped, redirected his momentum, sent him crashing into the sedan's hood. The driver reached for something. Thomas picked up the fallen gun, didn't aim it, just held it visibly. "Tell Dimitri this," Thomas said, breathing steady despite the violence. "The girl is the line. Cross it, and there won't be territory to negotiate over. There won't be business relationships. There won't be anything but consequences. I've spent 20 years building a reputation. Don't make me spend the next 20 proving it still applies." The first man struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs. "You just declared war." "No, I just defined the rules of peace. Dimitri can accept them or test them, his choice." Thomas dropped the gun's magazine, cleared the chamber, and tossed the weapon back to the man. Then he turned and walked away, his back exposed, knowing they wouldn't shoot. Not yet. Not until Dimitri decided whether Thomas's threat was real. When he reached the apartment building, Layla was waiting inside the lobby, her face pressed against the glass, terror in her eyes. Thomas entered, and she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I'm okay," he said quietly. "We're okay. They came because of me." Her voice was muffled against his coat. "This is my fault." Thomas knelt, meeting her eyes. "No. This is the consequence of the life I chose. You didn't create this danger. You just gave me a reason to walk away from it. What if they come back? Then I handle it. By yourself?" Thomas hesitated. The truth was complicated. "I have people, resources, and I have something Dimitri doesn't understand." "What?" "Something worth protecting. That makes me more dangerous than he realizes." Layla's grip tightened. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." "Then we understand each other," Thomas said gently. "Because I don't want you hurt either. Which is why this ends. Soon." That night, after Layla finally fell asleep, Thomas made 3 calls. The first to Jacob, explaining what had happened. The second to his lawyer, accelerating the guardianship paperwork. The third to someone he'd hoped never to contact again, a man who specialized in making people disappear. "I need a contingency plan," Thomas said. "If things go bad, I need the girl protected. Relocated if necessary. New identity, new life, completely untraceable. And you? I stay and finish what needs finishing." The man was quiet for a moment. "You're really doing this? Walking away from everything for one kid?" "Yes. Must be some kid." Thomas thought of Layla sleeping down the hall, finally safe enough to rest without nightmares. "She is," he said simply. The guardianship papers came through on a cold February morning. Thomas sat at his kitchen counter, staring at the official documents that made him legally responsible for Layla Davis. His lawyer had worked miracles, navigated background checks, managed home studies, smoothed over questions about Thomas's employment and finances. The story they'd crafted was simple. Thomas was a security consultant who'd encountered Layla in distress, and after verifying her stepfather's unsuitability, had petitioned for guardianship. Richard had signed away his rights without argument. One visit from Thomas's lawyer and the implicit threat behind it had been enough. "What are you reading?" Layla appeared in the hallway, already dressed for school. Thomas slid the papers across the counter. "This makes it official. I'm your legal guardian now." Layla picked up the documents, her fingers tracing the words carefully. "So I can stay? Forever? Until you're 18? Or until you decide you want something different?" "I won't want something different." Thomas smiled slightly. "You might. People change, especially kids." Layla set the papers down and looked at him with unusual seriousness. "Have you changed? Since you found me?" The question caught him off guard. Had he changed? The man who'd walked into that alley on Christmas Eve had been focused solely on survival, on maintaining power, on existing in careful isolation. The man sitting here now made school lunches and helped with homework and lay awake at night worrying about parent-teacher conferences. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "I've changed." "Good," Layla said, "because the person you were before sounds lonely." She grabbed her backpack and headed for the door, leaving Thomas sitting in stunned silence. This 8-year-old had just delivered a truth he'd spent 20 years avoiding. The rest of the day passed in careful routine. Thomas had transitioned fully out of active operations, now his empire distributed among trusted lieutenants, his involvement reduced to occasional consultations. The money still flowed, enough to support them comfortably, but the danger had diminished. Dimitri had tested the boundaries twice, more subtle probes, watching to see if Thomas's threats were genuine. Each time, Thomas had responded with measured force, nothing extreme, just enough to prove the line he'd drawn was real. Eventually, Dimitri had accepted the new reality. Thomas Powell's was out, and his one vulnerability was so fiercely protected that exploiting it would cost more than it gained. That evening, Thomas picked Layla up from her first therapy session. She climbed into the car quietly, her expression thoughtful. "How was it?" Thomas asked. "Weird." She asked a lot of questions about feelings. "Did you answer them?" "Some." Layla buckled her seatbelt. She asked if I felt safe now. I said yes. "Good." She asked if I was happy. Thomas glanced at her. "What did you say?" I said I'm learning how. Layla looked out the window. "Is that okay? To still be learning?" "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "That's more than okay." They drove in silence for a while. Then Layla spoke again. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" Always. Do you ever miss it? Your old life? Thomas considered the question honestly. Did he miss the power? The respect born of fear? The simplicity of a world where everything was transactional? Sometimes, he admitted, but not enough to go back. Because of me? Because of who I became when I chose you. Layla processed this. The therapist said that people who've been through hard things sometimes push away good things because they're waiting for them to turn bad. She said it's normal. Are you pushing me away? No, but I'm waiting, a little bit, for you to change your mind. Thomas pulled the car over, put it in park, and turned to face her fully. Layla, I'm not changing my mind. I'm not sending you away. This isn't temporary. You're my family now. That's permanent. Tears welled in her eyes. Promise? I promise. She nodded, wiping at her face. Okay, I believe you. They finished the drive home. That night, Layla asked if they could watch a movie together. They sat on the couch. Layla curled under a blanket. Thomas stretched out in the corner, watching something animated and ridiculous that made her laugh. Halfway through, she fell asleep against his shoulder. Thomas didn't move, just sat there. This child who'd survived abandonment and abuse, trusting him enough to sleep without fear. He thought about the man he'd been before Christmas Eve. Alone, powerful, empty. And he thought about who he was now. Guardian, protector, father in everything but name. The trade had cost him everything he'd built, and it was worth every single loss. Christmas Eve arrived again, exactly 1 year after Thomas had found Layla searching through trash in the snow. The apartment looked different now. There were pictures on the walls, photos from the past year, evidence of a life being lived rather than endured. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments Layla had insisted on buying, including several that were objectively ugly but meant something to her. Thomas stood at the window, watching snow fall over the city, remembering the coldest night of the year when everything had changed. Thomas? Layla's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Can you come here for a minute? He found her in the living room, holding something behind her back, nervous energy radiating from her small frame. I made you something, she said. For Christmas. It's not much, but she pulled out a piece of paper, a drawing, carefully rendered in colored pencils. It showed a narrow alley, snow falling, trash bins against brick walls, and 2 figures, a small girl searching through garbage, and a tall man in a long coat standing in the shadows, watching. But that was only half the drawing. The other half showed the same 2 figures sitting on a couch, watching television, laughing. The same apartment they were standing in now. Safe. Together. Home. At the bottom, in Layla's careful handwriting, were 3 words. My family. Forever. Thomas stared at the drawing, his throat tight with emotions he'd spent 20 years suppressing. This child who'd had every reason to stop trusting, to stop hoping, to accept that the world was cruel and people were temporary, had chosen to believe in permanence, had chosen to call him family. Do you like it? Layla asked uncertainly. Thomas knelt, meeting her eyes. It's the most important thing anyone's ever given me. Layla smiled, relieved. I wanted to show what changed, before and after, how everything is different now. It is different, Thomas agreed. Completely different. Are you happy it changed? Thomas thought about the empire he'd abandoned, the power he'd relinquished, the reputation he'd walked away from, the life he'd completely dismantled. And he thought about this moment kneeling in front of a child who called him family, holding a drawing that captured the most dangerous decision he'd ever made. Yes, he said simply. I'm happy it changed. Layla threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Me too. They spent the evening together, dinner, another terrible movie that Layla loved, hot chocolate before bed. Normal things, simple things, the kind of Christmas Eve that happened in thousands of homes across the city. But for Thomas, it was extraordinary. Because 1 year ago, he'd been alone in the cold, checking shadows out of habit, expecting nothing to change. And now he was here, tucking Layla into bed, listening to her talk about what she hoped Santa would bring, being the kind of person he'd never imagined becoming. Thomas? Layla said sleepily as he turned to leave her room. Yeah? I'm glad you found me, in that alley. I'm glad you didn't just walk away. Thomas paused in the doorway. I'm glad too. Do you think my mom would be happy? That I'm with you? The question pierced something deep in Thomas's chest. Yes, I think she'd be grateful you're safe and loved. That's what good parents want for their children. Layla nodded, satisfied. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Layla. He closed her door softly and returned to the living room. The drawing she'd made lay on the coffee table. Thomas picked it up, studying the contrast between the two halves: desperation and safety, loneliness and connection, survival and living. 1 year ago, he'd been the most feared man in the city. Now he was a father attending school events and learning to braid hair and worrying about whether Layla's science project would be ready on time. 1 year ago, showing weakness would have gotten him killed. Now his greatest strength was loving someone more than he feared the consequences. The choice had cost him everything he'd spent 20 years building, and it had given him everything he'd never known he needed. Thomas set the drawing carefully on the mantel where he could see it every day, a reminder of the moment everything changed. A reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing differently when given the chance. Outside, snow continued to fall over the city. Somewhere, people were making decisions that would define their futures. Somewhere, children were searching for safety in a world that too often failed them. But here, in this apartment, a former crime lord and an orphaned child had found something neither had been looking for. They'd found family. And in the end, that was the most dangerous thing Thomas Powles had ever protected, and the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.